happening out here, I didn't know how to proceed. I went to the Stowe Library, and it was suggested that I make contact with the Historic Commission. And when I did that, I sat with Jack Head, who was the chairman of the committee, and I outlined generally, verbally, if you can imagine it, what I'm talking about. So many people didn't even know what I was talking about at the meeting, but some did. But this one fellow sat opposite me. He said, you know, I have a mound out back of my place, a stone mound. Wow, and all of a sudden I just held on to that, and I called Jack the next day, and I said, would you mind if I have contact with the gentleman who spoke? He said, fine. Well, I went with this fellow out. We found this. I just was bowled over. I mean, this is probably the grand dream I had always hoped for, that somehow I would really see something significant in the landscape. This, we believe, was as much as 8 feet high at one time. It's been rumbled a little bit on top and eroded a bit. But the base, as you can see, had to start way out in order to attain. But it truly is a piece that, when you're out in the woods, it really is, really will take your breath away. It's so strong. Well, there's another view of it just from another direction. But that's the type of thing that we see in the land. This fellow helped me to understand that if I went even further north, I would still see something else. And I'll come back to that. What we have here is a term using the dictionary. This is known as a cairn, which was any of certain monumental piles of stones erected by early inhabitants of Great Britain. A heap of stones set up as a landmark, or another definition by another one. A cairn is an artificial mound of stones or boulders used in modern times as a boundary mark. A cairn may be round or elongated in shape. Now, let me give you one more, because we saw this term before. Remember, a heap of stones. Well, a heap is a raised mass of things or matter, a pile, hence a great mass, a quantity or number, to cast or bestow in great quantity, to become heaped or piled as sand, snow, and so forth. I've been to the Army Corps of Engineers in Waltham, and they concur that this type of marker is a surveyor's idea. And this, as you can see by the words I'm giving you, is a direct product of the British system of surveying. Now let me go back, and I'll show you another piece that this fellow showed me. This is his heap of stones here. We believe it is actually in the form of a triangle, and that the triangle face is facing magnetic north. But what he knew, because he's one of these fellows, he'd been the superintendent of highways for Stowe at one time. He's retired now, but he's one that goes out into the woods with his dogs, and he knows the land. I couldn't have done this without someone like this. But he goes out, and he says, you know, there's another marker up here on this same line. He takes me up here, and it's a different kind of marker entirely. It's a limestone marker. Looking down on it, it's about that big. We think it might be maybe as much as 4 feet, and that 2 feet are in the ground and maybe 2 feet out or something. This one happens to be really saved because finally a tree has grown around it and secured it, so it's not going anywhere unless the tree goes down. But many of these points are not necessarily always just a heap of stones. There are different markings. There are some that believe that maybe when they had the oxen group going out as a survey team, that they had a sled and that on these were made up. They may have been even made up in England and were brought as ballast on ships, and they're in there to be used specifically for these demarcations. But the point is that when I got back and was able to see this was exactly 2,000 foot. Well, then I realized that maybe if I go back all the way to 0, Yeah, this came out to 10,000. Then I realized maybe there's a system of 2,000-foot intervals for all of these, maybe going up through Boxbow and even southward. But using that as a supposition, another item did show up which was surprising to us. I've already alluded to the Pompasiticate Hill and the Common. Back here at this point, using a straight line on latitude line, there is a very interesting intersection of walls. This is just another method they had of demarcating. Let me show you another piece. I'll come back to this, but let me show you what's happening in all the adjacent towns. Here's Cambridge, but here's Watertown subdividing. They subdivide in a very orderly, structured way. These are called, I forget the name of it, it's a military term, squadrons. So they lay them down in absolute order and logic to it. It's not only there, we can even jump out to Lancaster, and we still see that same kind of order running through the layout of their original sites. Or we can go to Sudbury itself, and this may look, we see a number of years here in this chart, but the one that we should look at, where the origins were right in this piece in here. This is their original burial yard. This was their original meeting house. This is before any of these things. This is the very beginnings which is in Wayland. But again, you'll see, again, a logical, obvious system of how to demark the land. Well, I didn't know how to think about this, but I knew that, if you remember the map I showed showing the extension of the lands coming out, Concord was originally a square town of 8 miles square. When they created Sudbury, it was a square too. We don't see it that way today, but it was originally a 6 square mile. And they added another 2-mile piece in here. Now you'll see the Stowe line that exists today, and you'll see the what they call the Stowe River right in here. Well, what I'm interested in is what did they do here? And again, using writers, this is the beautiful book on Puritan Village, which was actually the book to do with Sudbury, as you know. It was written by Sumner Chilton Powell, and it won the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1964. But in this, he helps us to see from England all the way over to here how these land grants, and these are pretty much like I've been describing. But the thing that's interesting is this first division of Sudbury looked like this. It's not a map that we're familiar with, but here's the Concord line. This is the square of the original. They call it 5 miles here, and they call it 7 miles here. Actually, this should be 6. I think what they're doing is allowing for the chain and its lag. They usually are allowed something like 10% or something. But anyway, we know it as a 6-mile square. The 7 mile is probably picking up this based on the 5, so they're picking up the rest. But now you'll see the next division, which runs right against Stowe. And you'll see this same logical, terrifically regimented system of this strata system. What this is made up of 3 lots within it, which would be 50 acres. So any one of these is actually a 150-acre lot. But they can subdivide that down. And the point I'm making is that in Stowe, they created all of the original lots, which were 12, were based on 50-acre lots. So we now see, at least we have a neighbor who uses that system like this. This is the 150, but if you take one segment of this, or 1/3, there's the 50-acre lot. So that helped to give me some strength to see maybe what they did in Stowe. Now I'll go back to that point that you saw me look at earlier in Stowe, where I told you there was an interesting stone walls were created. This is the one going this way that goes to Pompasiticate Hill, and it's right on the latitude line, straight east-west to Pompasiticate Hill. This sighting is exactly, it's coming on these 2,000-foot increments that I showed you how they subdivided this to this point here. Yes, someone has knocked an opening through here now, but this ran out exactly for 150 feet this way, and then ran exactly 300 feet this way, which was double the 150. It sounds like making a simplified mathematical computational idea for them as surveyors out in the woods. These walls do not continue. They just absolutely end, and there's nothing out there. They're not enclosing anything. They're not enclosing any farmland or anything. They just sit there, and they're right along exactly where I would expect things to occur. And I honestly, when things like this happen, I can hardly believe it that they're happening. So now if we look back, we'll see this same simplified system. This was the heap of stones. But this ran to 10,000 down to here. But what they're doing is only using 4,000. In other words, 2 and another 2 to 4,000 for these intervals for these lots. So they're setting it 2,000 feet back of this latitude line. These are the 50-foot lots. Exactly. They're computed exactly correctly. And we know that the first lot was the minister's lot, number 1. The next one was Boaz Brown, number 2. We don't know, yes, we know probably the number sequence, maybe that they lived, but this is a hypothetical try on my own part. We don't have the proof that this is exactly it. But as I've shown it to people in Stowe, they nod that they think that might be the original way it was laid out. And now you'll see that this is a parallelogram which we've been watching from the grants that were given all the way along the way, like Russell's grant and other grants, you'll notice, even in Medway. They're all based on a parallelogram. A more precise view of what I'm talking about for Maynard, you will see the Maynard line. Excuse me. Yeah. I'm sorry. I deliberately didn't draw it on hard. You see this point? This is your Maynard line right here. You see that? And then from there, then it goes over up through to Akron. So it's there to there. But these lines are surprisingly cousins to one another somehow. I don't mean that necessarily this is absolutely parallel, but it's so close that it makes you wonder if maybe even the Maynard line was somewhat based on a fraction of this compass orientation. I've told you all about this now, and you understand it through to here and so forth. So this is a very poor picture, a Xerox copy, but the top one shows you the common today, not today, but in one of some time ago. And you'll see the minister's house very poorly out here in the back. And here's the minister's house here. This was the first house ever built. It still exists. Built in 1686. It's really takes your breath away to imagine that this was here at this time and is part of this structure. That's known as the Lower Village. And this is from an atlas that shows what you and I was out through to Maynard and Acton. This is what they call, Red Barn Road or something, and this is the 117. So here's the common. But I'm going to show you something that I detected in this system that just made me look twice. If I continued the red line, it will come over here to the stone wall that's in the woods that I was pointing to. But it runs right through here, the minister's house, up to Pompasiticate Hill, and that line goes through behind these houses. When I came down in here and poking my way around, I could hardly believe it that what I would find would be oh, I'm having trouble. Sorry, I got out of sequence here with these. Well, let me pick up and show you. I was showing you this. Let me show you another part of that. If you look back today towards the minister's house, this is a photograph today. So the common is right here to our right, and you're looking at the minister's house right there. And this was a little knoll, and they regarded that very specially for the siting of the minister's house. It was almost an ideal, dreamlike sequence. If you look at the other way, and this is where you go into the Stowe shopping center here on the right. So you're looking down 117, and this block here I'm interested in, which has the Stowe Travel Agency in it. But as we go on down, straight down through here like this, that's the line that goes through the minister's house. It's the one that will go finally up into the woods. And this is the stone wall I was showing you. This is actually the east-west line, and just stops, doesn't continue. Goes up and then makes a turn and goes on magnetic north up in there. And if you go right to the intersection, this is where that east wall is coming in here to this point, and then it turns and goes on magnetic north. Well, now let me go back and show you what caught my eye was this. Where'd it go? Well, I'm sorry, it's escaping me. Here it is. Lower Village. I backed this up. This is where you would have gone normally. This would have taken you up Crescent. But I noticed this came in, and what was happening out there was this. It was like a complete way of like almost a Roman highway came right through here. And no one has built in here. These lots come up, and the next lots start over. It's just sitting here, void of anything. We believe it's a continuation of the road system. If you look back, well, this is another view, wider, looking across, and there's a house to the left in there, but that's that whole strip of way. If you look back, you'll see the house now on the right instead of the left, but we're now looking back to the commercial block, which we had the Stowe Travel Agency, but look what's right up ahead. Pompasiticate Hill, right up where the tower is, and more precisely where the reservoir is. And this line is working its way directly up through to there, and it's, obviously that's in Maynard. Here's the original lot names. I will only be able to clarify these two out of the 12 original. Of course, the minister's lot and Boaz Brown. But these, if you go into Stowe, the Stowe people are very knowledgeable about these names, and then you see the next people and the next people and so forth, and these are very common names in Stowe. Now, the Georges colony is really not in this land. Here's the parallelogram for here. The Georges colony, though, is just south of this, which is the 421 degrees 55 minutes. This is the U.S. military reservation in here. So that's the piece, as far as Stowe is concerned, that a fairly big chunk of their town to do with the Georges colony is south of the Assabet River, and most of it is in the military reservation. I don't need to go more this way, and I may jump now. But these are maps that I did from assessor's maps. And if you went into your own town assessor's maps, they have page after page. But if you put them together as a collage, they are surprisingly logical, and that they probably are a definite product of, again, the U.S. Geodetic Survey system. So that's why there's such intelligence in these maps. And I'm willing to take the time to align these and get this. And so now you can really work down into the most contemporary lots in town, and you know exactly where this line is going. That's why I know how close it came to the Minister's Pond, and I know the stone walls in here and the mound up in here and the police station and so forth. So I really have a very good grasp of the reality of this land until finally you can get a picture like this. And when I show this in Stowe, obviously they can't confirm it, but they don't seem to deny that maybe that is logical from what they have heard and understand in their own history. This today would be that town center of Stowe. And all of us know this road well enough, 117, that finally goes up on Crescent Street, up and back, but it continues here. But this is the pond, and this is the cemetery. So here's the minister's house, and here's the common, and of course this is the shopping center here. And here's the building that is the Stowe Travel Agency. What possibly this might have been is something like this. The first 12 lots were probably laid out specifically on this road because we have a fairly good description of how they were supposed to lay them out. They were supposed to lay them out on the Lancaster Road. They were supposed to lay them out in a fairly tight configuration. This division is actually based on 500-foot lot frontage. And you remember it's going now some 4,000 feet back into the land for the 50-acre principle. So this is still a very big chunk of land. But arbitrarily, we've just set these buildings to represent, and usually these houses face south. Even those who are on even the south face south. But what we believe that the track that you and I use today like this, that this probably was the original road, as I showed you in behind the houses there. And that probably this was the most popular way to go because this had families and people to say hello to as you were going through. And then probably you broke and came up Bradley Lane and then continued on your way up Crescent Street. But anyway, that's just a try at it. Now you'll see one more. Most of these communities have particularly banded together tightly for a configuration in case they're going to set up a stockade around it. Now, we don't know that they ever did that, but this would lend itself very well for exactly that, and everything that's the real inhabitants of the original town would be contained within that. I've used that there's a cousin to this, which is surprisingly similar. This happens to be out at Deerfield. But this is, and those of us who really know this town, that it's an absolute straight mile from here to here. And over time, they've had a stockade around this. The first stockade, though, only came this far. Then they extended the stockade, but this was a reality. This is what they actually did in Deerfield. You can see the lot subdivisions that keep going outside. Of course, the tragedy of this is that in the winter, when the snows really pushed against this into high snow condition, it was no hardship for the Indians to come over and create the great massacre in Deerfield. But here we have a cousin, and surprisingly, these two towns were created very much in a very similar dating period of time. So we've used this just as a case in point. So there we have the story of Stowe. Now, if I go to another reference point here, the builders of the Bay Colony, and you'll remember this was our favorite historian, Samuel Eliot Morrison, but he's talking about Captain John Smith. He talks about a pestilence among the Indians of Massachusetts Bay that had decimated the tribes along our coast in 1617 and 1618. And from Maine to Cape Cod and westward to the country of Narragansett, there was only a pitiful handful of natives to dispute the white man. So now you understand when even Georges comes, he doesn't have really a terrible problem with an Indian bearing down on him aggressively. So he can really go into the hinterland and explore this. Now this is another map which shows you the original Indian reservations from Ponkapog out in Canton to Natick to the one that I was talking about, Magunko, and then out here in Grafton. And then you come up to Marlborough, and then you come up to Littleton for our famous neighbor here, and then even up to Lowell. But these sit, surprisingly, related in many ways to these lines. It looks like this was created by Gookin and the Eliot, the great one who worked with the Indians so much. They worked as a team. But when they went out into the land, they seemed to have a base to work from, to set up the general strata for how to lay out these towns. And if you look at just Stowe, it's amazing how they're surrounded by these Indian containments. Here's the one in Marlborough, and here's the one at the Neshoba. Here's Gookin. We believe his property is probably right about here. He got a 500-acre tract. That may be him. But the intimacy, now you look at Concord a little differently, and you realize, gee, they're surrounded by these reservations that are really closing in on their world. If you look at the original surveyor who wrote these notes, which actually was, I miss his name for the minute, but this map you should turn like this to be correct. This is the magnetic north line. And he tells you it's for 4 miles, and sure enough, he calls it the Pompasiticate line. And he also tells you, when I first saw that, because he didn't give us angles, he didn't give us a north compass, it left me barren without knowing what's he doing. But if you really sight it along these finally and put a square on, you'll find out that actually he's something like 7.5 degrees. Well, he says that he's 7.5 degrees off. We don't know why he's 7.5 degrees, because he didn't quite make up exactly the east-west line. But this is a study that's going on now up in Littleton to try to, in Boxborough, to see if they can understand more, because they only recently, I think, received quite a definite definition of Gookin's original properties, which may help us for the first time break through and understand what this Indian reservation was all about. Now, this I only put on as just to answer a question that some people have said. Why don't we see the next generation or the next one staying with this stand? Well, it doesn't work that way.